The first thing I noticed wasn't what was written. It was what was missing. A manila folder in a gray archive box, heavy paper, brittle edges, labeled in tidy old German script. The kind of handwriting that looks calm no matter what it's describing. The label read like something harmless. Administrative, scientific. But inside, 3 pages had been torn out so cleanly you could still see the fibers where the paper had separated. And on the inside cover, someone had stamped 2 words in purple ink. Geheime Reichssache. Secret matter of the Reich. That stamp doesn't mean classified the way we use the word now. It means someone decided this information was not just sensitive, it was combustible. I was in a basement reading room where the air never quite warms up. Fluorescent lights, the soft hum of dehumidifiers, a security camera that makes you aware of your own breathing. The archivist had slid the box across the table with the careful indifference of someone who has handled too many grim objects to flinch anymore. "Please keep the pages in order," she said, as if order was possible, because the moment I began turning those sheets, I realized I wasn't holding a normal record. I was holding the residue of an attempt to erase something from history. Not by denying it, by breaking it into fragments, distributing those fragments across agencies, languages, and decades, until the story became too inconvenient to reconstruct. And the longer I stared at those torn-out edges, the more one question lodged itself in my mind. What did someone work so hard to keep from being read? I didn't start this hunt chasing myths. I didn't go looking for wonder weapons or occult conspiracies. I went looking for paperwork, because paperwork is where regimes hide their real selves, not in speeches, not in parades, in memos, in requisition forms, in typed letters where cruelty is expressed as logistics. My interest began with a single line I saw referenced in a footnote, barely a sentence, about a supplementary file attached to Luftwaffe medical research during the war. The footnote hinted that the supplement had been misfiled after 1945. Misfiled. That's the archivist's polite word for lost, or hidden, or quietly relocated. I requested the box expecting it to be dry. I got a folder with missing pages, and a trail that pulled me into one of the darkest, most morally complicated corners of modern history, the Nazi medical experiments, and what happened to their documentation after the war. Because the true story isn't just what they did. It's what the world did with the evidence afterward. To understand why these files matter, you have to understand the setting. By 1942, Germany was fully at war. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced air crews. The Eastern Front was consuming lives at an industrial pace. And inside the Nazi system, science wasn't a neutral pursuit. Science was a tool to extend control, a tool to increase survival of the valuable, a tool to break the undesirable. The regime built a universe where human beings were categorized like inventory, and then it built institutions that treated those categories as permission. Concentration camps were not only sites of imprisonment and murder, they became laboratories. Because once a state decides some lives don't count, the next step is always the same. Those lives become available for labor, available for punishment, available for experimentation. And in Nazi Germany, the language of availability was often dressed in the vocabulary of medicine. The folder in front of me contained typed tables, columns, numbers, temperatures, exposure times, a line of handwriting in the margin, Versuch abgebrochen, experiment discontinued, like a product, not like a person. On another page, a letter signed by a senior SS figure addressed to a physician. The tone was oddly casual, the way powerful men write when they assume their authority is permanent. It referenced practical results and usefulness for the troops. Then it mentioned test subjects without naming them. I kept turning pages, and the story began to reveal itself, not as a single secret project, but as a chain, an experiment, a bureaucratic cleanup, a post-war scramble for documents, and a long shadow that reached into the modern world. And the missing pages? The missing pages were the hinge. Before we go further, one thing matters. This is not a story about clever villains or cinematic masterminds. This is a story about victims, about people who were stripped of identity and turned into data. If your mind tries to turn this into a thriller, resist that. The horror here isn't that the Nazis were mysterious. The horror is that much of what they did was methodical, paper-stamped, filed, signed. The first set of documents in the folder wasn't hidden because it was unknown. It was hidden because it was too direct. It described a set of hypothermia experiments, cold water immersion, exposure, observation of how long a human body can survive before the core temperature drops beyond recovery. This is documented history. It happened. It was investigated after the war. But the files I was reading weren't the famous summaries you find cited in textbooks. These were working papers, raw notes, and they had something the polished accounts often lose: the casual normality of the people running the experiments. One memo complained about insufficient ice supply. Another discussed measurement inconsistencies when the subjects began to convulse. A third mentioned scheduling around the camp's routine, as if suffering was just a calendar problem. And then I found a page with a list of names. Not the victims, the staff, the administrators, the chain of responsibility. The names led me to something else. A second folder referenced but not included. An annex. A supplemental file. A place where the regime sometimes placed what it didn't want on the primary record. Because that is how bureaucracies erase without burning. They bury by separating. The archive box contained only a portion of the story. To find the rest, I had to follow the trail the way investigators always do. Not by asking what is most dramatic, but by asking what connects. On the back of one sheet, faint pencil marks showed through. A set of reference codes. Numbers and abbreviations, a storage identifier. I copied them down. Hands slightly unsteady despite myself, because this wasn't just academic curiosity anymore. This felt like opening a door. The next day, I requested the related files. They arrived on a cart, stacked like ordinary bureaucracy. But one folder was different. It was thinner than it should have been. Its cover had been replaced. Newer paper, newer twine, and across the front someone had typed a title that didn't match the internal documents at all. A false label, a disguise. Inside, I found the missing pages. Not all of them, but enough. And what those pages contained wasn't a new kind of experiment. It was something more revealing. A record of the cleanup. By 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, there was a frantic effort to destroy evidence. Not because they suddenly found morality, because they understood accountability. Camp records were burned, paper was shredded, files were buried or moved, but documents are stubborn things. They multiply, they travel, they get copied. And when the Allies advanced, they captured what was left. The annex pages I found read like a post-mortem. Not of victims, of a program. It included correspondence about relocating research material, about sanitizing descriptions, about creating summaries suitable for external review. External review, that phrase hit me hard, because it suggested the writers didn't only fear courts, they feared their own allies. They feared the possibility that someone, even inside their system, might see the work and decide it was too poisonous to be used. Then came the sentence that changed the entire shape of the story. It was a typed line in a letter, the kind of line that could be overlooked if you weren't paying attention. The raw data have been handed over to evaluators outside the SS. Outside the SS. That means the data moved from the camp network, from the SS medical apparatus, to another institution, likely military, likely Luftwaffe, possibly research institutes involved in aviation medicine. A transfer, a laundering. Because once the raw numbers leave the hands that obtained them, the numbers can be treated like numbers again. And that's the moral trap. If you can separate data from the crime, you can use the data while pretending you didn't touch the blood. I sat back in my chair and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the basement. This wasn't only about what happened inside the camps. This was about what happened afterward, because I knew the post-war landscape. I knew how eager the world was to rebuild, how eager the new power blocks were to acquire expertise, how quickly morality gets negotiated when nations feel threatened. And I knew the name of the operation everyone remembers, Operation Paperclip, the U.S. program that brought German scientists and engineers to America after the war. A program surrounded by legal and ethical controversy. A program that, in some cases, involved sanitizing records and downplaying affiliations, not because the Americans were Nazis, because geopolitics has its own kind of hunger, and hunger makes people rationalize. So I asked myself a question that sounded like paranoia until I saw it there in ink. Was this file erased from history because it was too embarrassing for Germany, or because it was too useful for someone else? The next documents offered a new seed, a stamp, not German, English, a post-war classification marking, and an inventory note referencing microfilm. Microfilm means duplication. It means someone photographed the pages to preserve them. And if they preserved them, they intended to access them later. Which is exactly what you do when you think something will be strategically valuable. I spent the next week in a blur of reading room hours. The work is not glamorous. It's page after page of gray language. But then, every few hours, you find something that jolts you awake. A signature, a missing stamp, a letterhead from an institution that shouldn't be in that story. And slowly, the story assembled itself like a mosaic. Here is what the files suggested, in the most sober, defensible reading. A set of Nazi medical experiments, carried out with brutality, produced raw data. As the war turned, there was a deliberate effort to cleanse and relocate that data. Parts of the record were removed or relabeled. And after the war, fragments of those records were captured, archived, and, in some cases, reclassified by the victors. The erasure wasn't a single act, it was a process, a chain of decisions made by different people for different reasons. And in the gaps between those decisions, those torn pages, those false covers, the true story lived. But I still hadn't found the reason someone tore those specific pages out. Not just any pages. The pages that had been removed from the first folder were not tables. They weren't routine memos. They were narrative. They were the part of the story that could not be reduced to numbers. The part that named the method. The part that described what happened to bodies. And maybe, if I was right, the part that described what happened to the data afterward. On the 7th day, the archivist placed a new folder in front of me. No stamp on the cover, no title, just an old string tie and a faint smell of smoke. She didn't meet my eyes when she spoke. "This one is sensitive," she said. I wanted to laugh. Sensitive. As if sensitivity is the problem, as if the problem isn't what people did. I opened the folder, and inside was a thin, typed report with a clipped clinical heading. It was an evaluation summary, written after the war, in English. And the first line made my mouth go dry. Material reviewed includes experimental results obtained under conditions incompatible with medical ethics. Incompatible. That was the polite phrase. The rest of the paragraph discussed whether the results could be validated and applied. Applied. That word is where morality goes to die. Because applied means someone was considering using the data, using it for pilots, for troops, for survival training, for cold water rescue. Using it while burying the origin. Then I reached the final page. And that's where I found the experiment that had been erased. Not erased as in never happened. Erased as in never discussed in full. Because the report referenced a subset, a special series, a separate procedure, one that wasn't named in the famous post-war trials, one that wasn't in the widely cited summaries, a procedure described only by a code, V-13, a code that meant nothing to me at first. But the report provided a hint. V-13 involved combined exposure in cold water immersion with induced hypoxia to simulate high-altitude bailout conditions, combined. That was the key. A hybrid experiment. Not just cold, not just altitude. A compounded assault on the body, designed to mimic pilots ditching at sea after bailing out from a damaged aircraft. Designed to answer a military question. How long can a person remain functional before collapse? Not survival. Function, the ability to operate, to swim, to signal, to fight. And suddenly, the erasure made sense. Because the more practical the experiment, the more tempting the data. And the more tempting the data, the more inconvenient the ethics. I kept reading. The evaluation report described methodological strengths. It described unexpected consistency in results. It described recommendations for further testing under controlled conditions. Controlled, as if the original conditions weren't controlled, as if the problem was technical, not moral. Then it said something that felt like a confession. Due to the origin of the material, dissemination is restricted. Restricted. Not destroyed, not rejected. Restricted. Meaning kept, meaning held, meaning placed in a drawer where only certain hands can reach. At that point, I realized I wasn't reading only about Nazis. I was reading about human nature, about the way institutions behave when confronted with information that is both useful and contaminated. The instinct is not always to throw it away. The instinct is to control who gets to use it, to bury the story, and keep the advantage. But the evaluation report still didn't answer the most haunting question. Who were the subjects? The Nazis referred to them as test persons, numbers, categories, sometimes simply Häftling, prisoner. And in the post-war evaluation, the victims were absent entirely. Their suffering was compressed into a footnote about ethics. That's another kind of erasure. Not burning files, but removing names, removing faces, removing the fact that every number had a heartbeat. I needed a human link. So I went back to the original German working papers, and I hunted for anything personal, a scribble, a complaint, a logistical note that accidentally revealed identity. On a page about subject selection, I found a line that made my stomach turn. Suitable candidates include those deemed physically robust and politically expendable. Robust, expendable. That's how cruelty becomes efficient. As I traced the chain of references, another name appeared. A camp, and with it, a specific time window. Late 1942, early 1943, the period when the Luftwaffe's desperation for survival knowledge intersected with the SS's willingness to provide human bodies. And that's when I understood something else. The Nazis didn't need a secret experiment in the Hollywood sense. They already had one. The experiment was the state itself, a system designed to turn human beings into means. Still, V-13 mattered, because it was the subset that answered a question a military would want answered, and because the files suggested it was deliberately separated from the more famous trials, not because it was worse, but because it was more usable, and that makes it dangerous. I went back to the torn-out pages from the first folder. The fibers, the clean tear. Someone had removed narrative pages, pages that likely described procedures, maybe even discussed combined exposure, maybe listed outcomes in plain language, maybe contained signatures, maybe connected the Nazi file to the post-war evaluation. So I asked the archivist a question. Not directly, because direct questions make doors close. I asked about duplicate holdings, about whether certain files existed in other collections. She listened with the neutral face archivists use when they know more than they're allowed to tell you. Then she said, carefully, some materials were transferred between institutions after 1945. I waited. She added, and some were returned later, not always intact. Not intact, meaning edited, meaning curated, meaning someone had decided which truths were safe. That evening, back in my hotel room, I stared at my notes. codes, names, dates, reference numbers, and the phrase that kept repeating in my head. Outside the SS, evaluators, microfilm, restricted dissemination. If there was microfilm, there was a copy. If there was a copy, there was a storage list. If there was a storage list, there was a path. The next morning, I requested the microfilm inventory. It arrived in a binder that looked utterly unremarkable. Pages of index entries, roll numbers, descriptions so bland they bordered on intentional. Then I saw it. A roll labeled with an acronym. Not German, English. And next to it, a date, 1947, 2 years after the war, the era when the world was already shifting from justice to strategy, when allies became rivals, when knowledge became currency. I requested the roll. The machine whirred. The film advanced, and the screen filled with ghostly reversed text. I leaned in. Slowly, line by line, the missing pages appeared. The narrative, the procedure, the part someone had physically removed from the paper file. And there, in hard clinical German, was the description of V-13, combined cold immersion, induced hypoxia, timed functional tasks, a line about behavioral observation, not just whether the subject lived, but whether the subject could be made to obey, whether panic could be delayed, whether resistance could be broken. And then, worse than anything else, I saw the margin note, not from a Nazi physician, from an English-speaking evaluator. A pencil note, faint but legible. Results potentially valuable for air-sea rescue training. Potentially valuable. I sat back, because now the story had its second turning point. The experiment wasn't erased only because it was horrific. It was buried because it was tempting. And tempting things get protected. That is where the true story becomes uncomfortable, because it forces you to ask a question that has no clean answer. What do you do with knowledge produced by atrocity? Do you destroy it, refusing to let suffering become advantage? Or do you preserve it, believing the dead deserve to save the living? And if you preserve it, how do you prevent that act from becoming a kind of moral laundering, a way for institutions to benefit while claiming distance? The files don't answer that question. They simply present the evidence that people wrestled with it, and that some chose restriction over rejection, control over condemnation. In the next part of this story, the paper trail leaves the archive and enters the post-war world. It moves through interrogations, through trials, through intelligence agencies, through sanitized biographies, through the quiet decisions that determined which Nazis were prosecuted and which were repurposed. And it leads to the most unsettling revelation of all, that the true erasure wasn't the burning of files. It was the transformation of a crime into a resource. I left the archive that day with my notes folded like contraband in my pocket. Not because I planned to smuggle anything out. Everything I wrote down was allowed. But because the feeling in my chest was the same feeling you get when you realize you've stepped into a current you can't swim against. Once you know a thing exists, you can't unknow it. And once you know people tried to hide it, you start noticing the fingerprints of hiding everywhere. The paper trail didn't end at the microfilm reader. That was just the moment it crossed the line from wartime atrocity into post-war decision. Because the pencil note, those 3 words, potentially valuable, wasn't a German hand. It was the hand of the winner. The hand of the person who was supposed to close the file and say no. Instead, someone had leaned in and written yes, but quietly. For weeks after, I kept returning to the same question. Who was the evaluator? Not the Nazi physician, not the camp administrator, the post-war voice, the one who looked at blood-soaked data and saw a training application. If I had been less stubborn, I would have stopped there. Many researchers do, because the next step is where you stop dealing with archives and start dealing with institutions that still exist. Institutions with reputations, with budgets, with lawyers, with a stake in how history is framed. I began with the easiest thing to trace, the microfilm inventory itself. Every roll had an accession note, where it came from, when it arrived, who processed it. Most entries were vague. Captured material, recovered documents, transferred records. But the roll-containing V-13's narrative pages had a processing stamp that wasn't vague. It listed a unit, a post-war intelligence detachment, and a location. A city in Germany where the Allies had set up a major collection effort for military and scientific documents. That's not unusual. After 1945, the Allies captured mountains of paperwork. They created document centers. They translated, cataloged, and mined the material. Some of it went into war crimes trials, some of it went into history, and some of it, quietly, went into research pipelines. The next step was slow. I requested the detachment's processing logs, then the correspondence files that referenced those logs, then the indices for the indices. It sounds absurd until you've spent enough time in archives to understand the truth. Erasure is rarely a single act. It's a maze, a system designed so that no one sees the full picture unless they refuse to stop walking. In one correspondence bundle, I found an internal memo written in the late 1940s. The language was careful, not apologetic, careful. It discussed the ethical complications of certain acquired medical materials. It proposed a solution, not destruction, restricted access, controlled distribution, use by approved personnel, no reference to origin in public-facing training, no identification of the subjects, no naming of the camps, a firewall between the numbers and the bodies. That memo contained a phrase that felt like a ghost. Prevent reputational contamination. Reputational, not moral, not human. Reputational. As if the real hazard was not the suffering, but the stain. In another folder, I found something that made my hands go cold. A list, not of victims, a list of recommended holdings with check marks next to certain categories. High-altitude physiology, cold immersion, air-sea rescue, and next to those categories, a note. Priority for U.S. aviation medicine. Aviation medicine. That word is the bridge, because the Nazis were obsessed with pilot survival. So were the Allies. And the early Cold War amplified that obsession into something close to panic. If you believe the next war will involve long-range bombers, pilots over hostile seas, ejection at altitude, hypoxia, freezing water, then the data becomes tempting. Not because you admire the source, because you fear the future. And fear turns ethics into a negotiation. At that point, I knew I needed to see whether the V-13 material had ever been consulted, used as a reference, even if it wasn't cited. The challenge is that the absence of citation is the point. If someone wanted to use it without owning the origin, they would avoid leaving clean trails. So I looked for indirect traces, requests for German cold water survival studies, references to wartime immersion data, mentions of combined stressor series, the language of someone trying to talk about a thing without naming it. I found a clue in a training manuscript draft from the early 1950s, a document about air-sea rescue physiology. Most of it was standard: water temperature, survival time estimates, recommendations for equipment. But one paragraph stood out. It discussed functional time under combined cold and oxygen deprivation, not simply survival. Functional time. And the numbers listed in that paragraph matched the pattern I'd seen in the V-13 narrative pages. Not perfectly, not like a copy, like a translation, a laundering. The data had been rewritten into a new document with a clean face. No stamp, no camp, no victims, just numbers presented as if they fell from the sky. That was the moment the story stopped being only historical. Because now the question wasn't whether post-war evaluators considered using the material. The question was whether they did, and if they did, whether anyone ever took responsibility. I requested the manuscript's reference list. It was short, knowing, curated. It cited open literature. It cited Allied studies. It cited an unpublished German series without detail. Unpublished. That word is a curtain. It means, we have it. You don't. I tracked that phrase, unpublished German series, through later revisions. In a later edition, the phrase vanished. The paragraph remained. The numbers remained. Only the hint of origin had been removed. Another erasure. Not a dramatic one. A small edit. The kind of edit that turns a moral problem into a neutral statement. At this point, I did what you do when paper begins to feel like a locked door. I looked for living memory, not to extract secrets, to find someone who could tell me whether this argument, use versus reject, had ever been openly debated in the rooms where decisions were made. That search led me to an unexpected place. Not a government archive, a university medical library. Because the ethical debates didn't live only in classified memos. They lived in journals, in conference proceedings, in the letters of physicians who argued about whether tainted data could ever be redeemed. In a collection of papers belonging to a post-war medical ethicist, I found a correspondence exchange. The letters weren't about V-13 by name. They were about wartime data obtained under coercion. One physician argued that if the numbers could save lives, refusing them would be irresponsible. Another replied that using them would validate the method. A third wrote something that stopped me. Once you benefit from the crime, you become part of its lineage. Lineage! That's the word that makes it hard to look away, because it implies inheritance, not of guilt alone, of consequence. In those letters didn't resolve. It never does. But it revealed something else. By the 1950s, people already knew, not the public, not most citizens, but people inside medicine and military research knew the ethical contamination was real. And despite that, the system still chose restricted access over rejection. Which brings us to the turning point of this story. Not the discovery of V-13, not the microfilm. The moment I realized why this particular experiment was erased more thoroughly than others, because V-13 wasn't just a worst-case display of cruelty, it was a bridge. A piece of research that sat precisely at the intersection of two worlds, the world of camp atrocity and the world of aviation medicine. And bridges are dangerous because they allow crossing. The files had one more surprise. Buried in a post-war routing slip, yellowing, nearly overlooked, was a list of recipients. Names of offices, not public institutions, not courts, offices connected to defense research. And next to one office, a handwritten note. Do not circulate beyond medical branch. Avoid political exposure. Avoid political exposure. It wasn't just about ethics. It was about scandal. It was about how quickly public outrage can reshape policy. The people moving these papers weren't thinking like historians ensuring preservation. They were thinking like managers preventing fallout. I sat with that slip for a long time. Because it reframed everything. The secret wasn't that an experiment existed. The secret was that after the war, people tried to decide whether the results could be separated from the crime. And in at least one thread of the record, the decision leaned toward use, quietly, indirectly, without admitting it. At this point, you might be wondering, if the evidence is there, why wasn't it widely known? Why wasn't V-13 named in every discussion of Nazi medical experiments? Why didn't it become part of the standard narrative? The answer is simple and uncomfortable, because narratives are shaped not only by what happened, but by what can be proven publicly. And proof depends on access. Access depends on classification. Classification depends on politics. And politics depends on what people fear revealing about themselves. The Nazis committed the atrocity. That fact never changes. But the post-war world inherited the evidence. And the post-war world had its own motives. Justice. Yes. But also strategy, also image, also control. If you want to see how that inheritance played out, look at the way war crimes trials worked. They focused on what could be prosecuted, what could be demonstrated, what could be presented clearly to judges. Certain experiments became emblematic. They were documented, witnessed, testified. Other fragments, especially those that complicated the moral clean line between them and us, were less likely to be foregrounded. Not necessarily because anyone said, let's hide it. Sometimes because the system simply prefers stories that let the winners feel clean. But even if the files were preserved, the victims were still absent. And that absence became intolerable. Because if you talk about Nazi experiments only as data and program names and post-war memos, you repeat the original violence. You turn people into numbers. Again. So I did something that felt small compared to the weight of the archive. I went looking for names, not the staff, not the evaluators, the human beings whose lives had been treated as disposable. That search is its own kind of grief, because the records are incomplete by design. Some were destroyed, some were never kept. Some were kept in the language of bureaucracy that refuses to describe suffering. And some were preserved only in testimony, shaking voices at trials, letters written decades later, memory passed through families. In an index tied to camp documentation, I found a transport list that overlapped with the time window of V-13. I found a fragmentary entry. Initials, a prisoner number, a note indicating transfer to a medical block. Then another. No detailed narrative, no confession, just traces. But traces are enough to tell you this. There were individuals, not subjects, individuals, one number repeated in multiple places, a prisoner whose movements through the camp paperwork formed a faint line. I won't speak the full identifying details here, as if I'm announcing a twist. This isn't entertainment, but I can tell you what I did next. I followed that line into survivor archives, into recorded testimonies, into the living wound of memory. In a testimony recorded long after the war, a survivor described something that sounded eerily familiar. Not cold immersion alone, not altitude alone. The combination. Being weakened, then plunged, then forced to perform tasks, hold a position, answer questions, obey commands, while the body rebelled. The survivor didn't call it V-13. He didn't know the code. He called it what it was. A procedure, a punishment disguised as research. Hearing it described by a human voice did something the archive never can. It took the sterile language and broke it open. It restored the moral center. The victims were never supposed to have the last word. They were supposed to disappear, and yet there he was, decades later, naming the reality. That testimony became my anchor, because it meant I wasn't just holding documents. I was holding a piece of someone's lived horror, and now the post-war pencil note, potentially valuable, felt even more obscene. Not only because it suggested use, because it suggested a second theft, the theft of meaning, turning someone's suffering into a training number. At this stage, I reached out, carefully, to a historian who had spent decades studying wartime medicine. I didn't present myself as a crusader. I presented the evidence, the microfilm, the routing slip, the training manuscript paragraph, the overlap with testimony. And I asked the only question that mattered. Have you seen this series referenced before? He studied the copies for a long time. Then he said something that made the air feel thin. I've heard rumors, he said. Rumors? Not because no one knew, because no one had documentation they could point to without risking reputations. He told me that certain wartime data had circulated in closed circles for years, that some researchers avoided mentioning it, that others dismissed it as unreliable, that the ethical debate had never been purely hypothetical, because people had always suspected the material was being consulted. Quietly. He also said something else, something that brought a kind of clarity. Even if someone used those numbers, he said, they don't belong to the people who used them. They belong to the people who paid for them, and the only ethical use begins with naming that payment. Naming. That became my goal. Not revenge, not scandal, naming. So I returned to the archive one final time. Not chasing more secrets, chasing completeness. I requested every record connected to the microfilm accession, every routing slip, every translation memo, every classification note. And then I did something that felt almost ceremonial. I copied the pencil note exactly as it appeared. Not just the words, the pressure of the strokes, the slight tilt of the handwriting, because it mattered that a person wrote it. Not a system. A person. Someone with a hand, someone with a mind. Someone who chose to see value instead of horror. I don't tell you this because I believe we can put history on trial and feel satisfied. History isn't a courtroom, it's a mirror. And what it reflects depends on whether we dare to look. If you're still with me, here's the part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into a documentary. The part that feels quiet and human, because after months of chasing files, I realized something. The true erasure wasn't only in the archives. It was in how easily the world slips into abstraction. We speak about Nazi experiments as if the phrase itself contains the horror, but phrases are how we distance ourselves. We say it, then we move on. The files I found didn't change what happened. They can't. Nothing can undo it. But they did change one thing. They showed how the story continued after 1945, how the evidence became a bargaining chip, how the data became a temptation, how the moral line became negotiable when the Cold War began. And that's why I can't tell this as a clean mystery solved. Because the ending isn't a reveal. The ending is a decision. What do we do with knowledge born from atrocity? What do we do with institutions that tried to benefit without accountability? What do we do with the human tendency to treat suffering as a resource? The most honest answer is also the least satisfying. We tell the truth. Not the convenient truth. Not the patriotic truth. Not the truth that lets the winners feel pure. The full truth. That the crimes happened. That the records were curated. That some people debated use. That some people chose restriction. That some evidence suggests the numbers were consulted, and that the victims were often erased twice, first in life, then in memory. In the last week of my research, I returned to the basement reading room one more time. I asked the archivist for a book of testimonies, not because I needed citations, because I needed balance. I needed to remind myself why the paper mattered. I read a survivor's words aloud, quietly under my breath. No audience, no camera, just a human voice in a cold room. And as I read, something inside me shifted. This wasn't about my discovery. It was about their existence, about refusing to let their experience be reduced to a code, V-13. V-13 is what perpetrators write. Names are what the living owe. So here is the final image I want to leave you with. Not a file stamp, not an archive box, not a thrilling red string pinned to a board, a table, a strip of fluorescent light, a stack of pages that look ordinary until you read them, and a moment of realization that history doesn't disappear because it's forgotten. It disappears because someone chose to make it difficult to find. The Nazis tried to burn their evidence. They tried to tear out narrative pages. They tried to refile, relabel, relocate. They tried to turn people into numbers. And after the war, the world that defeated them faced a temptation to use what was useful, to hide what was shameful, to keep the advantage, to avoid political exposure. That's what these files revealed. Not a supernatural secret, a human one. The uncomfortable continuity of moral compromise. If you came into this story expecting an ending where everything is neatly resolved, I can't give you that. Because the real ending happens every time a new generation decides what it wants to remember. Every time a researcher chooses to keep walking through the maze. Every time an institution decides whether to open a drawer. Every time a viewer, like you, hears the phrase Nazi experiment and refuses to let it remain abstract. The files were almost erased. But paper has a stubborn kind of survival. It hides. It waits. It endures long enough for someone to care. And maybe that's the only justice archives can offer. Not punishment, not redemption, just preservation. A refusal to let the world move on too quickly. A refusal to let victims be erased a second time. Because the most dangerous part of a secret isn't that it's hidden, it's that hiding it teaches everyone else what kind of truth is considered inconvenient. And once a society learns to hide inconvenient truths, the next atrocity becomes easier. Not because people forget the past, because they learn the technique. So when I tell you I found the files, I'm not asking you to feel impressed. I'm asking you to feel responsible, to remember that behind every code, behind every series, behind every unpublished German data set, there were human beings who did not volunteer, who were not asked, who were not spared. And if any institution ever benefited from what was done to them, then the least we can do now is this: say it plainly, name it honestly, and refuse the comfort of forgetting.